Let's drive a wedge between what I call constitutional conservatives, small government conservatives, and neocons. Your talk yesterday, you went into the Trotskyite history of what a real neoconservative is. Do any of these conservatives that are now carrying their water even know that?
Probably not, but what fun to talk about. Yes. So here's the thing. Look, when I was a kid, a Republican meant Ronald Reagan and George Bush and James Baker, like, I don't know, businessmen, oil men, conservative Christians, I don't know, white guys, basically. So who are the neocons? Well, they're like this weird little sect of Republicans. A lot of them are Democrats again now. But the thing is, people use that term so broadly to just mean anyone who's a hawk.
By the
that
way,
guy's a neocon.
they're all never Trumpers.
Yeah.
Which apparently has been forgotten.
No, not all of them. Not all of them. That's the rub, right? Bill Kristol hates him. His brother-in-law, Elliot Abrams, worked for him. So they're try to split their differences as best as they can. The Democrats need good, horrible, right-wing, not right-wing, hawkish, leadership. So Bill Kristol goes back to lead their efforts against Trump, right, and become their hero and keep them good and hawkish. So they're all playing their role. But anyway, the thing is, like, I just met this nice girl who goes, hey, thanks to you, I'm no longer a neocon. I'm like, nah, you were never a neocon lady, you were just a hawk. But the neocons, they really are like 100 people or less, right? It's a weird sect of dudes. They are not exclusively Jewish. And I know people, Mark Levin, I guess lately had said, oh, it's just a smear term for Jews and just whatever like that. And people like Max Boot and others have protested that all along. But it's funny because, Irving Kristol wrote a book called Neoconservatism, right? That's Bill Kristol's father. And so
obviously an anti-Semite.
Yes, a horrible guy on that issue specifically. No, but so look, Justin Raimondo, my mentor at antiwar.com, was such a great chronicler of this. Murray Rothbard, of course, one of the most important leaders of the libertarian movement, was blood enemies of these guys, and in alliance with the paleo-conservatives like Pat Buchanan and Scott McConnell and others, they waged heroic wars against these guys back in the late 20th century. And so, I don't know, what the hell, how much time we got? A bit? Or what?
We got time, but
time.
Don't you have to go do something?
I don't know.
We got time.
So listen, so there are a few different routes that these guys took. They were Trotskyites. The original generation, they were Trotskyites. And so Trotsky was, of course, the founder of the Red Army and leader of the revolution in the Soviet Union in 1917, but then was later, after Lenin died, betrayed by Stalin and murdered. But the difference in doctrine was Stalin wanted communism in one country. His dictatorship, hold it here, maybe expand as far as East Germany in the war, but otherwise, conserve the communist revolution they got. Trotsky wanted to overthrow the whole world, right? Kill the Pope, and set everything on fire. And this is a big part of neoconservative tradition. This is what Michael Ledeen called creative destruction. He doesn't mean it like capitalists mean it, that a good business goes out of business, but a better one gets their assets and makes more efficient use of them or whatever. They mean carpet bombing things. And then that's what's created. Michael Ledeen said we need to create a boiling cauldron in the Middle East and then shape it to mean, whatever we want in the end. This is completely like this Trotskyite revolutionary fire in the mines kind of a thing. Like the split between Jefferson and Paine. Paine said, come on, let's go to Europe and overthrow all the kings. And they were like, no, we got what we got here. We've got to have a balanced budget, Yeah. So anyway, this is where their origins are. And so, but see, because they were Trotskyites and Americans, of course, they sided with America in the Cold War because they hated Stalin and what the USSR had become, contrary to their dreams, right? And so they then became hardcore Cold Warriors. And Stalin turned very anti-Semitic by the end of the 30s, right? So they were, or in practice at least, who knows what was on that guy's mind. But, he ran out a lot of the Jewish original leaders of the Bolshevik Revolution and stuff. And so the American Trotskyite communists were very opposed to the new Stalinist USSR, right? And I guess at least after the Second World War. But anyway, so they started moving to the right. And there are a few different avenues. There was William F. Buckley, who was a CIA agent and whose job it was to make the right synonymous with the conservative movement, when the conservative movement was really only part of the right, along with libertarians and Randians and different kinds of Christian sects and all different things that were going on. And Buckley's job was to essentially homogenize the right and through the National Review and make it Cold War first. And so he ran out, famously, the horrible racists, but then also all the Randians because they were atheists, all the libertarians because they were against the Cold War, and anybody who knew anything about economics because they'd be opposed to economic policy required to fight the Cold War, and all that. And so then who'd he replace all the actual right-wingers with? A bunch of commies. Sidney Hook and James Burnham and Whittaker Chambers and like all of these original writers for the National Review were all a bunch of Reds. And their job was to say being right-wing means supporting the world empire to oppose the Soviet Union. As Buckley put it, we must accept, this is a real quote from Commonweal magazine, 1952, we must accept a totalitarian bureaucracy on our shores, even with Truman at the reins of it all, in order to fight the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So this is the neoconservative consensus as well. Many of them became sort of like right-wing Cold War Democrats, and that's where they, many of them ended up working for Scoop Jackson, for example, a senator from Washington State. They called him the senator from Boeing, who was like a Truman Democrat, Cold War Democrat, right? But then, then you had this guy named Max Schachman, and I always think it's the Social Democrats USA, but it's something just like that. I think that's wrong. It's something just like that. And he had trained a bunch of these guys, including like Gene Kirkpatrick and Joshua Moravchik and a bunch of these guys. And then there was, at the University of Chicago, Leo Strauss and Albert Wohlstetter were both also previously Trotskyites who had moved to the right, and then both became the mentors of the next generation neoconservatives. And then of course you had Irving Kristol and Norman Podhoretz, Commentary Magazine, and that whole crew. And like, so these are like, they're the Abrams family and the Kristol family and the Podhoretz family, and all these people are all like intermarried and all worked together and have all promoted each other over many years. One of the greatest chroniclers of neoconservatism in America is a guy named Jim Loeb. He's just a fantastic guy, and he has this wonderful article called All in the Neocon Family, and it was about how Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, is now working for Dick Cheney as his foreign policy advisor. Oh, this ought to be good. And then he's talking about how you can fit all the neocons at one big Thanksgiving dinner table, because this is like who they are. So now, fast forward to the important part. Now it's H.W. Bush had instructions to his National Security Advisor, General Brent Scowcroft. Keep the crazies in the basement. They're allowed to kill people down in Latin America, but they're not allowed to mess with the Middle East, right? So you had, they were somewhat involved in the lower levels of the Defense Department and messing around in El Salvador and Nicaragua.
Crazies being the neocons.
The neocons,
Yeah.
right. Now, 8 years of Clinton goes by, they're running the Project for a New American Century, they write the Clean Break Doctrine for Benjamin Netanyahu, which if you'd like to ask me about that, I can go into detail about the role of all that thinking in Iraq War II. And they created PNAC, and they wrote Rebuilding America's Defenses, explaining essentially the doctrine of American hegemony. And then when W. Bush was elected, Dick Cheney hired them for everything. So in the vice president's office, you had especially Scooter Libby, but also John Hanna and Eric Edelman. On the National Security Council, you had Stephen Hadley, Robert Joseph, Zalmay Khalilzad, and Elliot Abrams. In the State Department, David Wormser was there for a time where his job was to prevent Colin Powell and Dick Armitage, his right-hand man, from interfering too much in their plans. And then at the Defense Department, on the Defense Policy Board, you had Gene Kirkpatrick, Richard Pearl was the chair, and a major ringleader of this plot, along with Newt Gingrich, who's not actually a neoconservative, but is close with them, sort of like John Bolton, was never a leftist of any kind. He's a Barry Goldwater, right-wing nationalist, Warhawk, pure as they come, Reaganite, right? But very, very close to them, and worked in the State Department. Had a very important role there, and definitely was part of this network. And then, but still continuing in the Defense Department. So on the Defense Policy Board was Pearl, Kenneth Edelman, Gene Kirkpatrick, Newt Gingrich, and one other really bad one, I forget. And then the Deputy Secretary of Defense was Paul Wolfowitz. Under him was Douglas Feith. And then you had, under him was a guy named Abram Shulsky, and he ran what was called the Office of Special Plans. And this is where they funneled all the lies in from the Iraqi exiles and manufactured and dug through the CIA's trash looking for whatever they could try to cherry pick to build a case about weapons of mass destruction. And then across the hall, David Wormser, again, with a guy named Michael Maloof, ran a group called the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, PTEG thing, something, and they were in charge of coming up with lies about Iraq and Al-Qaeda. And there's this huge operation to stovepipe all this data directly up to the vice president's office and directly out to the media. And they even brag. We put 890 stories out there making these claims and all this stuff. And I have, by the way, if anyone wants to look into this, I have a thread that people can find on X. I've redone it a few times. It's up to like, I think 30 articles now, but I think if you search like 28 articles about how the neoconservatives lied us into war, you'll find a thread by me that just has, I collect these things. So, and I remember from back then, and there's so much stuff about how this happened. So it wasn't James Baker and the Texas oil men. It was Tel Aviv and their agents in the United States who had essentially infiltrated the American government. Now, Colin Powell's chief of staff, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, told me that he thought, look, all these guys, essentially if you ask them, they would just tell you America's interests and Israel's interests are the same. So what's the problem? It's all fine and no problem. But he said there's no question in his mind that Douglas Feith and David Wormser were acting directly as agents of Israel. And there's even a funny quote where, from the Nelson Report, which was this high-level insider magazine in Washington at the time, maybe still, where Donald Rumsfeld couldn't make it, so they sent Douglas Feith in his place to a White House meeting. And after he was done talking, Condoleezza Rice said, "Thanks, Doug, but when we want Tel Aviv's opinion, we'll just ask the ambassador." So it was widely known that that was what it was all about. And then, Andrew Coburn reported that George W. Bush never even asked anyone, what is a neoconservative, until 2006. Okay, 2 years after he'd been reelected, right? His term's almost over. And he asked his father, who also, people remember him as being smarter because they think he killed Kennedy and all this stuff, but he also was an absolute idiot. That's how this idiot son came out of him. And so the idiot father says to him, he says, "Dad, what is a neocon?" And his father says, "Who or what?" And he says, "What?" And his father says, "Israel."
Thank you for watching Kibbe on Liberty. You can watch new episodes every Wednesday anywhere that you consume podcasts, on YouTube, on Apple, on Spotify, whatever. Watch, click, like, check it out.